Hi guys, we're going to talk about chemistry and illicit drugs today. Sorry I have my camera off. It's a Sunday night and I'm feeling Sunday night, and so I don't really want to have my face on camera. So I'm not gonna, because we don't always have to have our faces on camera. Sometimes that's okay. Okay, so let's talk about what a drug is. So there are basically three components to the definition of a drug. It can be a natural substance or a synthetic substance. So natural means coming from nature, synthetic means made in a lab. It's designed with the purpose of producing a set of psychological or physiological effects. If it's a synthetic drug, it's designed that way. Otherwise, nature designed it that way, and we happened to find out that we have receptors in our brains and on our cells that help us have these psychological or physiological effects. And those effects happen on the human body or on other animals' bodies. So we know that drugs work on other animals because we have medication for our dogs and our cats and our horses and our livestock and all of the animals that we care about out there in the world. Drug abuse happens when somebody is taking drugs for purposes other than those for which they are intended. So my daughter takes a stimulant every morning. She's not abusing drugs. That's a prescription drug that has been prescribed for her for medical purposes. Many of you take stimulants every morning because if you have ADHD meds, that's what it is. That is what could be considered an illicit drug if it weren't a prescription for you, meant to help you, and you're taking it as prescribed. If you stop taking it as prescribed or give it to someone it hasn't been prescribed to, then it becomes drug abuse. So it's not necessarily the drug, it's how it gets used. So it's really, really important to talk about the history of drug control in the United States. And in fact, this is something that I've seen more and more things coming up on social media about this. And so you may have seen some of this, you may have encountered some of this already, and you're going to go, hey, I've seen this. So in 1875 is when we had the first anti-drug law in the United States. And it was a local law. So it was a law just in San Francisco, in the city of San Francisco. And what it did was it outlawed the smoking of opium in public opium dens. So at the time, everybody was using opium. All different kinds of opium were getting used, but specifically one type of opium was smoking opium. And the reason that that kind was targeted was because smoking opium while gathering together was mainly a Chinese activity. So by doing that, this was essentially a way to criminalize Chinese customs and to keep Chinese people from getting together, because the white people in San Francisco were afraid and intimidated by the Chinese people and needed some way to break up these groups and keep them from getting together and hanging out, and also just kind of criminalize some activity. So there were other forms of opium, for example, liquid opium, and that was okay. That was fine. You were totally allowed to do that. But since smoking opium was uniquely Chinese, that's the kind that they targeted. So in 1906, then we had the Pure Food and Drugs Act, and that targeted specifically cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and opium. It required that any food or drugs transported across state lines were both unadulterated, meaning they were pure. They hadn't been, cut with other things. They didn't have other additives in them. They weren't messed up with, other things to sort of bulk them up and make them a higher mass with a less pure substance, and then making them dangerous. And then they also had to be properly labeled about their ingredients. So notice that the Pure Food and Drugs Act did not say cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and opium were illegal. They just said, if you're going to be transporting it across state lines, it better be pure, it better be clean, it better be good, and it better be labeled right. Okay. So what that said was if you didn't do that, if you had adulterated cocaine, cannabis, heroin, opium, or if you didn't have it properly labeled, then you could get fined, or they could take your materials and then make you pay additional fees to destroy the material. So to add insult to injury, they not only take away your cocaine and your heroin, but then they make you pay for the destruction of the cocaine or the heroin that was improperly labeled or was impure for some reason. In 1909, we passed the Opium Exclusion Act, and this was the first federal anti-drug law, and it created the first illegal drug. So remember, the Pure Food and Drug Act didn't make anything illegal. It just put rules on the transport. This is the first time we said, hey, here's a drug you're not allowed to use. Notice this happened in 1909. That was just a little over 100 years ago. So we think about these things as having been forbidden and taboo and awful for forever, but really they haven't been. it's only been a little over 100 years, and opium was the first one that we said was going to be illegal. So that barred the import of opium for smoking. Again, this is the smoking opium that you can't bring in. And it was partially passed on the advice of the State Department because we as a government, the US government, was trying to figure out how to work out trade deals with China. And so in restricting the import of opium for smoking, we were giving a little nod to China for other various trade deals. And so it was a little bit of a political thing. And it was a little bit of a, giving a nudge to our Chinese citizens who, again, were attempting to gather together and smoke opium together recreationally. It did not bar the import of opium for drinking or for injection. Okay, that's how white people used it at the time. And you could even buy opium at the pharmacy and keep it in your medicine cabinet at home. In fact, here is Stickney & Poor's Pure Paregoric. Notice that it is 46% alcohol, 1 and 3/16 grains of opium to each fluid ounce. Notice the dosing. At 5 days old, you could give your baby 5 drops of this substance that's alcohol and opium. At 2 weeks old, you could give your baby 8 drops of this substance. And at 5 years old, 25 drops. And by the time you're an adult, you can have a whole teaspoonful. So again, opium for drinking, fine. Opium for injection, fine. That's how the white folks were using it. Opium for smoking, not okay, because that's how other people were using it. Seeing an entrepreneurial opportunity, however, people who were less law inclined moved in and they wanted to fill the void. And so they started distributing opium clandestinely. So they were undercover. So this is where we got sort of a black market for drugs. So as soon as we made opium illegal, we created this black market for drugs. Okay. But that also meant supply was down, prices went up. When prices went up, people wanted to get their opium, so violent crime also went up. San Francisco then took the law a step further, criminalized possession of opium for smoking, so you didn't even have to be doing it, you just had to be carrying it. And that now created this new class of criminal that we had never had before, which is the illicit drug consumer. So we never had people who were prosecuted drug users until 1909 with the Opium Exclusion Act, and we were targeting the people who were carrying around opium for smoking. In 1914, we have the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. So what this did was it prohibited the non-medicinal use of opium, morphine, and cocaine. But why cocaine? What did cocaine ever do to anyone? Cocaine's been just fine. We made sure it was pure when we passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. We were using it. We had been using it again in our medicine cabinets. We had cocaine toothache drops. It was an instantaneous cure because, of course, for sale by all druggists in 1885, because when you put a little cocaine on your teeth, it's definitely going to make them stop hurting. And then Coca-Cola. I'm sure you've all heard that Coca-Cola actually was created as a cocaine beverage. And here you go, not surprisingly, it relieved exhaustion. So if you were tired, then you would just drink some Coca-Cola because that cocaine was gonna make you feel better. But of course, why? Why did we need to do this? Well, because a group of people decided that we needed to pass a law. And so what they did was they linked cocaine use to violent antisocial behavior that they said was being perpetrated by Black people. So they created this rumor of the Negro cocaine fiends being the new Southern menace. And so they said, cocaine is out there, but the Black people, they really cannot handle their cocaine. Everybody else, you're all good with it, but we have to do this to protect people from these Black people. These Black people are going off, they're, raping and murdering and creating all of these horrible crimes. And it's the cocaine that's doing it. Now, really, again, this was a political move. And it was a political move to do 2 things. One was it was associated with trade deals again. So this was part of a bigger, more global trade deal issue. But it was also a way that was used to sort of put Black people in their place and give them something that they were doing illegally and would be targeted for doing illegally, because white people, it's not as big of a deal if you're using cocaine, but it's okay because it's okay in your system. Black people, you just can't handle your cocaine, so we're going to have to arrest you for it. So it became another way for us to criminalize a group of people. In 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was formed, and it was within the Treasury Department. So take a minute and think about that. The Treasury Department deals with money, and we put the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the Treasury Department. So we're consolidating the enforcement of other departments. All of those other departments had been gripped by some scandal or another, and we put all the drug enforcement in one place. So this guy named Harry J. Anslinger was appointed, and he was appointed by his wife's uncle to be the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Well, here's the deal. Before 1930, before the foundation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Anslinger was on the record saying that it was really absurd to think that cannabis would make people violent. At the time, he was the head of the Bureau of Prohibition. So he was like, alcohol, alcohol, alcohol. That's what's bad. Get rid of the alcohol. The alcohol is harming people. Cannabis, that's fine. No big deal. But now he's the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he's got to do something because prohibition is coming to an end. Prohibition is about to go away. And he needs to have something to do with his Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He needs some kind of something interesting to hang his hat on and say, here's why I'm important and you need to keep me and you need to have me here in this position. So what he did was he centered in on this last decade where these Southwest border towns were talking about this lawlessness and all of these crimes that this stuff they called marijuana was causing in Mexicans. And so they said these Mexican people on these border towns are causing all of these problems because of the marijuana that they're smoking. Now, I'm sure it didn't have anything to do with any kind of border dispute or any kind of poverty or any kind of social or racial disparities. I'm sure, yes, it was just the marijuana. That was sarcasm. I don't think it was. I think people were saying Mexicans are smoking marijuana, this stuff that they're calling marijuana, and so that needs to be made illegal. So Anslinger then said, aha, I've got it. It's the marijuana. The marijuana is a problem. There are horrible negative effects to smoking marijuana. We need to go after that and make that illegal. So he got those reports. He started asking for reports and he got them. Doctors started writing reports. People started writing reports. And he created this over 200 files that were called the Gore files. And he used the Gore files as the basis for articles he wrote. And then he went and testified before Congress and said, hey, here's why we need laws making marijuana illegal. He created a national campaign against marijuana use. You've probably learned in your social studies class about yellow journalism, which is like completely, well, I'm going to say garbage journalism. And he even wrote his own articles. So he created all of these articles about marijuana and how bad it was and how awful it was. And it wasn't research. We're not talking about any kind of like peer-reviewed scientific research or anything, but he got all these articles out. And so he created this media campaign. So in 1937, he wanted to create the Marijuana Tax Act. And that required anyone distributing or selling marijuana to pay taxes on it. But his campaign had been so successful in 46 of the 48 states that they had already banned marijuana. So anybody who wanted to do the right thing and pay the tax would also have to incriminate themselves. So when he started out, he just wanted to put a tax on marijuana, but he had done such a good job of making it sound evil, that everybody had made it illegal. So by the time you want to pay the tax, you can't, because if you pay the tax, then that means you're admitting to distributing or selling it, and then you're in trouble for that. It has since been discovered that 198 of the 200 cases in the Gore files were actually completely unrelated to marijuana use. The other two are undetermined because there's actually no documentation of them at all. So it's not that they were or weren't related to marijuana, it's that we don't even know that they existed. One other issue that came up is that doctors actually didn't know what was happening because doctors didn't realize that marijuana, which was a slang word at the time, applied to cannabis. And they actually had been prescribing cannabis to patients for medical uses, but it didn't click for them. They didn't know that when all of these laws were being proposed saying we got to get rid of cannabis, the doctors didn't speak out because they didn't think anybody was coming after cannabis. They thought people were coming after marijuana, which they thought was a whole different thing. So in fact, marijuana is a slang term that I'm trying to get out of my vocabulary. I'm having a very hard time getting it out of my vocabulary because marijuana is a very racially, a term that came out for very racial reasons and for, law enforcement reasons and for just sort of, the wrong reasons. Cannabis is a much more accurate name. It's also a nice scientific name. So I'm trying to use that word more often. Because this whole thing was, the whole origin of making marijuana illegal started in this really kind of crazy way. So then 1952, we've got the Boggs Act. This is the first time that we impose mandatory minimum sentence for narcotics violations. So what a mandatory minimum sentence means is that something is put in the statute where the judge doesn't have any leeway at all. So maybe it says for possession for X amount of this drug, the person must have 5 years in jail, period. No conversation about it at all. 5 years is the minimum. They got to go to jail for 5 years. So it didn't allow any wiggle room for any kind of judgment by the judge. 1956, the Narcotic Control Act made mandatory minimums even more severe. Took away judges' discretion in suspending sentences. So they couldn't even say, here's your sentence, it's 5 years, but I'm going to suspend it because I think there was some kind of mitigating circumstance, or offering parole when prison seemed like an inappropriate punishment. So any of that sort of judgment that judges, it's in the name, got to use started to get taken away. In 1970, we have the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And what that did is that basically we said, you know what, there are too many little piecemeal drugs. We got all these little drugs out there in the world. We need to bring them all together into one law that, sort of consolidates everything. So it repealed or updated all of the previous laws regarding narcotics and dangerous drugs, LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines, all of those things, and put all controlled substances within the federal realm. So it made everything controlled a federal issue. Classified all the controlled substances with a scheduling system. And we'll talk about the scheduling system in a little bit. But it was basically just a way of sorting drugs into how harmful they are. 1971 was the start of what we call the war on drugs. You've probably heard people refer to the war on drugs. This is a really interesting quote from an interview regarding the start of the war on drugs. So this was from a Nixon campaign, someone deep in the Nixon campaign, a campaign consultant who was working there. And he says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Okay, so this is where we have a presidential campaign that's specifically targeting groups of people, associating groups of people with drugs, and then talking about how bad those drugs are, so that then by the transitive property, those people are bad, and now you've disrupted the communities. So specifically going after communities using drug as the vehicle for that. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was created and was tasked to combat drug smuggling and illicit drug use in the U.S. And they do also coordinate and pursue U.S. drug investigations both at home and abroad. So when we talk about drugs coming in and out of the country, that's also a DEA issue. 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was reported to allocate funds to new prisons, drug education, and treatment. The main result of what we got out of that was more mandatory minimum sentences for more drugs, including cannabis. And an example of one thing that happened there is that there was a minimum sentence of 5 years without parole for a possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine or 500 grams of powdered cocaine. So this is a 100-to-1 ratio. So You can have 100 times as much powdered cocaine as you can have of crack cocaine to get the same sentence. So what's the issue here? Well, there were two different kinds of cocaine out there in the world, and those two different kinds of cocaine were in two different kinds of neighborhoods. Crack cocaine was in the black neighborhoods. Some people will tell you that the government took the crack cocaine to the black neighborhoods. I have not investigated that claim, so I cannot confirm or deny that claim. But crack cocaine was a lot cheaper and you could buy in much smaller amounts. And so that was in more poverty-stricken neighborhoods, you would find crack cocaine. And powdered cocaine was in the white affluent neighborhoods. And so you had to have significantly more powdered cocaine in order to get some kind of sentence for it. So this was incredibly inequitable. In 2010, they did at least bring this down a little bit and make it an 18-to-1 ratio. A lot of research has been done. Some people will say crack cocaine is significantly worse for you than powdered cocaine. All of the research I have read has said, no, it's not. Okay, so if we look at main problem drugs around the world, what you will see, so there's a little key up here. So the purple are the opiates. The yellow is cannabis. The green is cocaine type. The blue is amphetamine type, and then the gray is others. So North America, you can see cannabis and cocaine are sort of the major abused drugs, problem drugs here. This is according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes. You can see most of South America is cocaine type. That's an agricultural issue. Cocaine grows well in those environments. When you get down here, you've got cocaine and more cannabis happening. Africa, lots and lots of cannabis use in Africa, again, agriculturally. And then over here in Asia and Europe, you've got bigger issues with opiates because poppies grow really nicely there. When we come over here, we have the marijuana and the opiates happening in Australia. And then you can see the amphetamines happening in sort of these other little pockets happening here. I don't know what's going on up here. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting if you think about it globally, where problem drugs are. It kind of makes sense. And so you can kind of associate the drugs with the locations and where they've come from. All right, so why should we regulate drugs? People who say we should regulate drugs say it's for the public good. Everybody should be a productive member of society. There is a relatively widespread belief now in our society that drug abuse is immoral, although I will say in the last 10 or 15 years, that has started to be less so. People are starting to calm down about drug use and not really be as judgy about it. People say there are horrible health issues that come along with doing drugs. There are behaviors that are associated with addiction and dependency that are considered to be antisocial. Probably your inhibitions are down and you maybe do things you wouldn't ordinarily do out in public. And then a lot of other crimes are associated with dependency on drugs. So thefts and homicides and prostitution, typically because of the desire to get money so that then you can go buy more drugs. But why not regulate drugs? There are a lot of people who say we need to not regulate drugs. People are going to find a way to do it anyway, so we may as well make it safer and maybe make some money off of the taxes on it. That should say off, not of. Maybe make some money off of the taxes on it. And maybe make sure that instead of people getting heroin laced with fentanyl, they're just getting heroin, which sounds crazy. But if someone whose child is a heroin user dies from heroin mixed with fentanyl that they didn't know they were getting, I bet their parents would say, I'd rather they were getting heroin that they were getting in controlled doses and that, maybe they were getting weaned off of and taken care of and things like that. Also, laws are not enforced consistently across racial and economic groups. Despite the fact that white people are way more likely to be using powdered cocaine, they are way less likely to be busted for any kind of cocaine possession or cocaine use laws. They just aren't policed as heavily. We have policing issues, we have conviction issues, we have prosecution issues, we have all kinds of things happening that are making it so that these drug laws, are being specifically used to target different racial and socioeconomic groups unfairly. And then people, would really say drugs are not really the problem. We need to address poverty. We need to address mental health. We need to address educational disparities. We need to address all of these other things. And that would be way more beneficial, because if you're not poor, then you don't feel like you need to use drugs to escape your life. If you have opportunities, educational opportunities that are going to lead you into a good job, that will make you make more money, that will make you happier with what you're doing and feeling more productive in society, you're not going to use drugs as an escape. And so if we target these other things, then the drug problem will sort of sort itself out. All right, so let's get down to the nitty gritty. The classification scheduling is determined by the DEA. Remember, I mentioned that before. And it's based on three things. It's based on three things. The drug's potential for abuse. So how likely is it to be abused? The pharmacology, what it does to you. And again, that's another one. I'm going to put you off and tell you what it does, what those are in a minute. And whether or not it has a legitimate medical use. So does this thing have a legitimate medical use or not? Schedule 1 drugs are highly addictive and they have no legitimate medical use. Schedule 5 drugs have a low potential for abuse and are pretty well accepted for medical purposes. So Schedule 1 drugs are things like heroin. Heroin is highly addictive. There's no legitimate medical use for it right now. Interestingly enough, technically, according to the federal government and the DEA, cannabis is still a Schedule 1 drug. So, according to the federal government, having marijuana, having cannabis, I told you I'm working on it. I'm not doing a very good job of it. Having cannabis is still illegal. So no matter what state you're in, no matter what the state's laws say, having cannabis is still illegal. For the most part, the DEA just kind of gives you a wink and a nod and lets you get away with it because in your state it's legal, but they could come get you if they wanted to. I think those of you who are on the ADHD drugs, I think the methylphenidate, things like that, I think those are technically a Schedule 2 drug. So they do have a higher potential for addiction, but they do have a medical purpose to them. But they are, when you have to get them refilled at the pharmacy, they're a little sketchier to get refilled. You can't just, hit auto refill on those. And that's because of the drug schedule that they are. Another way we can classify drugs is by their origin. So some of them are naturally occurring. They're found in nature, and part or all of the organism is used as the drug. So cannabis is an example of that. Peyote, psilocybin. So if you're eating shrooms, psilocybin comes from shrooms. Peyote is cactus. So it comes off a piece of the cactus. And so you just eat it or smoke it, and it's just there in nature and it's out there. Then there's plant extract. So they come from naturally occurring substances, but they have to be extracted from them and then ingested. So cocaine is a plant extract. Morphine is a plant extract. Codeine is a plant extract. Semi-synthetic drugs are derived chemically from a naturally occurring substance. So you start with a naturally occurring substance, and then you do a little chemistry on it. So you start with something that came out of nature, and then you do a little work in the lab, and then you've got the drug. Heroin and LSD are examples of those. And then there are purely synthetic drugs that are totally human-made. They are just people in a lab making stuff up. That's amphetamines, PCP, oxycodone, things like that. Those are synthetic, completely human-made. And then there's pharmacological effect, which I referred to a couple slides ago. There are stimulants that elevate mood, like amphetamines and cocaine. There are depressants that are sedatives. They're also hypnotics. They decrease your brain activity. Alcohol is a depressant. There are barbiturates. There are quaaludes. Some of you guys might be saying, no, I get really hyper and excited and silly when I drink alcohol. First of all, you shouldn't be drinking alcohol, so stop that. But second of all, the reason that people do that is because what it does is it depresses a part of your nervous system in your brain that is where your inhibitions come from. So it is a depressant. It does slow things down. You just might not notice that in someone over 21 who you see drinking alcohol because you're seeing their inhibitions get depressed, and then the things that their inhibitions aren't keeping under wraps are actually coming out. Narcotics are derived from opium. They're used for pain. When they're used appropriately, they're used for pain. They are abused for the feelings of peace, rest, relief from anxiety, and escapism. Those are things like morphine, heroin, Demerol, fentanyl, and narco refers to sleep. Okay, so it refers to sleeping. So narcotics are drugs that are going to make you sleepy. And then there are hallucinogens. So hallucinogens are taken for their psychoactive effects. They're the ones that are going to make you see stuff and hear stuff that's not really there. That would be LSD, psilocybin, cannabis, and MDMA, which is ecstasy. So those are all the ones that are taken for giving you these experiences that are not real. Okay, so what does all this have to do with me? Why do I have to learn this, Ms. Gnant? Why are you telling me all of this stuff? Well, here is one interesting piece of research that I want you to take with you out into the world. And this is a study titled Health Disparities in Drug and Alcohol Use Disorders, a 12-year longitudinal study of youths after detention. So the first thing is it's longitudinal. It's 12 years. It went on for a long time. We're not talking about a study that happened for 6 months or 8 months. It went on for 12 years. And these are youths. These are teenagers. Okay, these are teenagers going into adulthood. This happens to have been done on this research happens to have been done with youths who had been in detention, who had been in some kind of group home or some kind of detention for some kind of activity that they were doing that they shouldn't have been doing. And so basically what they did is they did a bunch of surveys, and I don't know if they did drug tests or whatever. I think it was mainly surveys and interviews periodically over time. So the objectives, if we look up at the top, the objectives to examine sex and racial or ethnic differences and the prevalence of 9 substance use disorders. So they looked at alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens or PCPs, opiates, amphetamines, inhalants, sedatives, or an unspecified drug. And they tracked them for the 12 years after detention. This was actually done locally with the Northwestern Juvenile Project, so it was right by us, a prospective study of 1,829 youths. An N of 1,800 is a pretty good N. That's a pretty good number. That's a pretty good size study. Started in 1995. They were re-interviewed up to 9 times, either in the community or whatever correctional facility they were in through 2011. And then this is what they were assessed with. Now, here's what's interesting on the results. By a median age of 28 years old, 91.3% of males and 78.5% of females had ever had a substance use disorder. At most follow-ups, males had greater odds of alcohol and marijuana use disorders. Drug use disorders were most prevalent among non-Hispanic whites, followed by Hispanics, then African Americans. And non-Hispanic whites, compared to African Americans, non-Hispanic whites had 32 times the odds of a cocaine use disorder. So the non-Hispanic whites were 32 times as likely to be using cocaine in this study. So this is the complete opposite, completely contrary to where these cocaine use laws came from with these so-called with these black men in the fields who were becoming these cocaine fiends. We're seeing a completely different situation as the reality and the truth. So the conclusions drawn after detention, substance use disorders had a great difference between sex, race and ethnicity, and the substance abused, and contrary to stereotypes, did not disproportionately affect African Americans. And then there's their recommendation that if we want to treat substance abuse, it would reach many people in need and address health disparities in a highly vulnerable population, meaning people who have been detained. So what I want you to take away from this is that a lot of those stereotypes that we have in the world are not accurate stereotypes. A lot of those things that we have in our heads are not accurate things. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the year when we looked at drug testing welfare applicants and we said, well, if they're welfare applicants, they're probably on drugs. And then when we dug deeper into the research, we said, no, people with jobs actually are more likely to be drug users than people without jobs. So I want you to always be questioning those stereotypes. Always be asking yourselves, is that the reality? If I go look at research, is that the reality? Is that stereotype the reality? Does the data support that? Because whenever we're talking about these types of socioeconomic and racial stereotypes, chances are it's not the reality. And you guys are about to go out into the world and you're about to be voters who are voting for politicians, who are voting for laws, who are voting for referendums, who are voting for school boards and all of these various things. And some of you guys are going to be politicians and some of you guys are going to be on school boards and some of you guys are going to be working companies that make these different decisions. And I want you to always be the kinds of people who are thinking about, is this the reality? Who am I helping? Who am I hurting with this? Okay. So there you go. If you have any questions about any of this, please reach out and let me know.